The coronation of Charlemagne caused consternation in Constantinople and is the cause of the sort of final cultural separation between Constantinople and the West. It's a very important and positive development in Western history in general because it established that in the final analysis, the supreme spiritual power, the Pope, judges and establishes the supreme temporal power. So it vindicates the hierarchy between them implied in Gelasius's letter to the Emperor Anastasius hundreds of years previously, and it would become the precedent for the power of popes in the later Middle Ages to discipline and depose emperors who violated the teachings of the Church. Nevertheless, in terms of the unity of Christendom, it was extremely divisive. So long as the Latins had had the highest ranking bishop, communion with whom defined membership of the Church, they were willing to accept, as it were, that the Greeks, not that they called themselves the Greeks in those days, but anyway, the Greek speakers possessed the highest ranking Christian ruler, and a sort of final loyalty to which, however nominal, defined one's participation in the Res Publica Christiana, to use a later term. Once the Pope claimed to have turned the King of the Franks into the Roman Emperor, that overlapping unity of distant temporal and distant spiritual loyalty was broken. And the indifference that the Greek speakers felt towards the Latin barbarian West turned into hostility rather than mere indifference. And the deference and slight tension of the Latins towards the Greeks was transformed to a kind of resentment and a kind of superiority complex. From this point onwards, the Latins ceased to refer to the subjects of the emperor in Constantinople as Romans, and they ceased to refer to him as the Roman emperor, and they start to call them Greeks and call the emperor in Constantinople, if they're being diplomatic, the emperor of Constantinople, if they're being very diplomatic, the emperor of New Rome, but more usually the emperor of the Greeks or even the king of the Greeks, which would be particularly outrageously offensive to the Romans in the East. The reason for this is, as mentioned, they didn't call themselves Greeks, they very much just called themselves Romans, and in fact the term Greek in ordinary language in the East didn't mean a Greek speaker, or even really an ancient Greek, although it could in some contexts mean that, but generally it meant a pagan. A Hellene meant someone who was attached to the old pagan religion, as opposed to a Roman, which was a subject of the emperor in Constantinople. And of course the title king was considered extremely insulting by the emperor, because they were not unaware that kings were little people who ruled individual nations, as opposed to the emperor, who was the legitimate ruler of the world as far as they were concerned. So all of this had centuries of tension and deteriorating relations baked into it. Nevertheless, Charlemagne was initially very keen to receive some kind of recognition from the authorities in Constantinople for his new imperial title. There was even some tentative initial suggestions that he might marry Irene. This presumably would have been a nominal marriage. Probably there was no chance of Irene travelling across the Adriatic for nuptials with Charlemagne, or Charlemagne risking a voyage to Constantinople. But anyway, nothing came of that because Irene was deposed relatively soon after the coronation of Charlemagne. Later on, one of the emperors agreed to allow recognition of Charlemagne's use of the title emperor, but not emperor of the Romans. And in fact, whereas the emperors in Constantinople generally just described themselves as emperors, and the Roman was taken for granted because they didn't think of anybody else having an emperor, or even really fully being a legitimate ruler. From this time onwards, they are very careful to always describe themselves as emperors of the Romans in order to distinguish themselves from any newish invented emperors that might be around out there. Now, the deposition of Irene did not immediately mean a return to iconoclasm. However, eventually there was a return to iconoclasm in the Eastern Empire because the emperors who succeeded to Irene were militarily unsuccessful. One of them, in a catastrophic way, was defeated and captured by Krum, the Khan of the Bulgars, an Asiatic barbarian group that were invading the European territories dangerously close to Constantinople at the time. And Krum had the emperor's skull hollowed out and lined with silver and turned into a goblet. I'm told that he's still a major national hero in Bulgaria, and in and around Bulgaria you will see statues of him holding his favourite mug, overflowing with, no doubt wine or mead or something, or whatever the Bulgars drank in those days. So, as we've mentioned before, victory was very closely tied to legitimacy in the mind of the Romans. So having yourself defeated and killed and your skull turned into a goblet was about as discrediting an event as could possibly occur for a Roman emperor. And as a result, the iconoclasts had their chance, and the campaign against the icons was resumed. However, it would finally end in the same way as it ended the first time, this time in 842, when once again the emperor died and his heir was an infant, the Emperor Michael III, and the empire was ruled by his mother as regent, and she was an iconodule, and she restored the icons once again. And Constantinople once again recognised the Second Council of Nicaea as a true and the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And this was a definitive victory. Iconoclasm was never able to reassert itself in the East, and nor did it emerge in the West until the Reformation. And in the following year, a synod was held, and the icons were all formally restored to the churches. And this event is celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy on the first Sunday in Advent, not Advent, Lent, the Great Fast, in the Byzantine Rite every year. And in fact, there's a rather fine ceremony which is performed in monasteries and cathedral churches in the Byzantine Rite on that day, when every heresy that has ever raised itself up against the church is anathematized, solemnly anathematized in turn by the abbot or bishop in a sung sequence of anathemas. Very dramatic, worth seeing if you happen to be near to a Melkite monastery or something of this nature. So, back in the West, there was a problem. It seemed as if everything was now wonderful. Learning had been restored, regular government had been restored. Charlemagne was very keen on regularizing the liturgy, so Alcuin sent to the Pope for the Roman versions of the liturgical texts, and seems to have developed what became the first missal and codified the Roman rite across the West in a more Roman form than it had previously held. And also monasticism became standardized. The rule of St. Benedict was seen as the ultimate Roman form of monasticism, and therefore only people who followed that were recognized as monks from that time onwards until much later in the Middle Ages. And people were still able to follow the rule of St. Augustine of Hippo because he was so prestigious you could hardly forbid the use of his rule, but they were referred to as canons rather than monks because they weren't following the rule of St. Benedict. So there's a great deal of standardization going on and apparently a great deal of stability. But this appearance was somewhat illusory because the king of the Franks, now the emperor of the Romans, Charlemagne, was still really a barbarian war leader, and he still really maintained the loyalty of his followers in large part because he successfully won battles, expanded his territory, gathered loot and distributed it between his followers. In fact, he defeated the Asiatic group, the Avars, during this time, and found an enormous treasure trove in their possession, which guaranteed the loyalty of his followers for the rest of his reign. But by the time of his death in 814, he'd really reached the limit of the geopolitical extension the strategic possibilities of the kind of administration and technology that the Franks were able to dispose of. And that meant that without any further exterior victorious campaigns, there was a very strong danger that the Frankish kingdom would implode into a series of civil wars, which did in fact happen. And paradoxically, because the clergy and those who were very much attached to Charlemagne's Roman vision for his own and his realm's identity were less and less enthusiastic about the idea of perpetually dividing the territories between the offspring of each king, as has previously happened, because they were hardening the proto-bureaucratic reality of these territories. That meant that when they split between the grandchildren of Charlemagne, as eventually happened, these splits became permanent instead of temporary as they had been in previous centuries. Charlemagne apparently said to people at the time, according to his biographer Einhard, who knew him, that he was quite upset by his coronation in 800 and that he wouldn't have entered St. Peter's Basilica if he'd known what was going to happen. This is a mysterious statement because we know that he was invited to take the title Roman Emperor by the same synod as had witnessed the purging oath of Leo III only a few days earlier. So it can't be the fact of his coronation or his assumption of the imperial title itself which offended him. It is presumably something about the ceremony that some way indicated that it was the Pope who was making him the emperor. And Charlemagne never returned to Rome after he was crowned emperor, and he took the trouble to crown his son Louis the Pious himself. In fact, Charlemagne had wanted, like his ancestors, to divide his territory between all his surviving sons, so the possible dissolution of his empire might have occurred straight away after his death, except that in fact all of his sons predeceased him apart from Louis, and so Louis the Pious succeeded him as emperor. And Louis also crowned himself emperor, as the Tsars would later do, probably also to avoid the implication that he was reliant on the Pope for the legitimacy of his title, but he lost his nerve and eventually travelled down to Rome and had himself crowned by the Pope, thereby really confirming forever the principle that a true Christian Roman emperor, at least as far as the Westerners were concerned, had to be crowned and created by the Pope. Louis was not as decisive a ruler as his father. He wasn't able to expand the empire any further. There were a number of very serious disputes between himself and his sons about how the empire was to be divided among them on his death. He was more enthusiastic than his sons were than his father had been, about the idea of trying to maintain some sort of unity for the empire, and was interested in the idea of possibly giving it all, or at least some kind of supremacy over the other parts of it, to his eldest son, Lothar. And Lothar attempted to claim that for himself when Louis the Pious died, but he was defeated by his two younger brothers, who were still alive at that time, Louis the German and Charles the Bald. And as a result, Charlemagne's empire was divided into three parts: a western part, which was ruled by Charles the Bald, which eventually became the Kingdom of France, as we now know it, and the easternmost part, which was ruled by Louis the German, which eventually became Germany, as we now know it. And then there was a central section ruled by Lothar, Francia Media, Middle Francia, which became known as Lotharingia, the realm of Lothar. And from that was not stable enough. It wasn't able to maintain its existence as a unitary kingdom, and anyway was divided by Lothar between his sons. But it also hasn't, with the exception of the regions of Lorraine, which is in fact just French for Lotharingia, and Alsace, which are part of France. But other than those regions, it hasn't remained in either Germany or France, but its territory has become the modern countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and the northern part of the modern state of Italy. So as you can see, this is a very formative time for later history because it lies at the origin of later Western European state formation. The civil wars carried on. The Carolingian dynasty became increasingly discredited, and by the following century they were eventually ejected from all their remaining territories, and the male line of Charlemagne's descendants died out. So although Charlemagne had so many children and so many descendants eventually through the female line that it's been estimated that all living people of European origin are in fact now descended from Charlemagne, nevertheless his male line died out and his dynasty died out, and his empire was divided up into those kingdoms, leading to a period of some anarchy in the West. In the East, after the restoration of the images, some years later, the Emperor Michael III decided that he wished to rule in his own name, and he didn't want to have his mother to be the regent anymore, similar dispute as with Irene. His mother was packed off to a convent, and Michael, who doesn't seem to have been very hard-working, in fact he's known to posterity as Michael the Drunkard, decided that he still wanted a close relative to actually run things for him, but he didn't like being told what to do by his mother, so he asked his mother's brother to adopt the title Caesar, deputy emperor, and to help run the empire for him. This man was a man named Bardas. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the triumph of orthodoxy, a consensual, iconodual but consensual figure had been appointed as the Patriarch of Constantinople. But on his death, he was succeeded by Patriarch Saint Ignatius of Constantinople, who was actually the castrated son of one of the unfortunate emperors immediately after Irene, who'd been confined to a monastery but had eventually risen to become patriarch. He was more associated with the intransigents who had fiercely and more heroically defended the icons during the second period of iconoclasm, and who were associated with Saint Theodore the Studite, who was the hero of that second period of resistance. He had poor relations with a bishop in Syracuse, who he had refused to recognize, and also a very poor relationship with the head of the Byzantine civil service, a man called Photios. These quarrels would come back to haunt him when he fell out with Bardas. Bardas was keen to facilitate the drunken lifestyle of his nephew, because of course that left him in command of the state, and also had taken a liking to the widow of his son. His son had passed away, and apparently Bardas had begun an affair with his daughter-in-law. And this was widely known and somewhat scandalous in Constantinople. And one day when Bardas came to the Hagia Sophia to attend the Divine Liturgy and presumably receive communion, he was barred entry by Patriarch Saint Ignatius. This greatly infuriated him, and he prevailed upon the Emperor Michael III to depose and imprison the Patriarch. They immediately tried to find someone to succeed Ignatius as Patriarch of Constantinople, but no one was willing, so they turned to the head of the civil service, Photios, who was a famous polymath, though wholly ignorant of Latin. He was very well informed about ancient Greek literature, and he agreed to be consecrated as Bishop of Constantinople. This was quite scandalous. He was a layman. He was consecrated very quickly, passing through all the orders without observing the required waiting periods mandated by canon law. He was also ordained to the episcopate by the excommunicate bishop from Syracuse that Ignatius had quarrelled with, and he was ordained to a see that was already occupied by another bishop. Therefore, simultaneously, as one Catholic historian has observed, excommunicated 3 times on a single day because of these 3 different offences. Hoping to cover up the irregularity of his ascension to the See of Constantinople, Photius appealed to the Pope to ratify his appointment, and he was hoping that this would succeed, both because the Pope, St. Nicholas the Great, then was the Pope, both because he thought the Pope would appreciate the recognition of Rome's primacy implied in the appeal, and also because Ignatius had had slightly difficult relationship with Rome because Rome had wanted to arbitrate over the quarrel with the bishop from Sicily, and Ignatius had not been very pleased about that, as there was a dispute over who was the rightful patriarch over Sicily. Sicily had always been part of the Roman Patriarchate, but that territory had been confiscated from Rome by the iconoclastic emperors and had been attributed to Constantinople. And even after the defeat of iconoclasm, the bishops of Constantinople had not been very keen to return Sicily to the control of the Pope as Western Patriarch. So Photius anticipated for these reasons that Rome would look favourably on his appeal, and he was able to bribe and corrupt the legates that the Pope sent in order to have it ensure that a favourable report of his right to the see was sent back to Pope Nicholas. However, disappointingly for Photius, in the meantime, messengers had managed to get from the imprisoned Ignatius to the Pope and tell him what the real situation was, and therefore Nicholas rejected the claims of Photius to Constantinople. This put Photius in a very difficult situation because he had accepted the jurisdiction of the Pope, but now his appeal had been denied. So he needed to find some way of denying that St. Nicholas was really the Pope. And so he wanted to accuse him of some sort of heresy so that he could claim that he had forfeited the See of Rome. So he was scratching around for what to accuse Nicholas of, and he came across the fact that the Frankish missionaries who were trying to convert the Bulgars, when they recited the Nicene Creed, included the phrase "and the Son," filioque, when they recited the section about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father. Now, this was not actually used in Rome or by the popes, although they upheld this doctrine. The doctrine also was upheld in the East. In fact, at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea, the Patriarch Constantinople had overtly proclaimed in his own profession of faith at the council that the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. But the Easterners didn't use the expression from the Father and the Son because the word proceed means something slightly different in Greek to what it means in Latin. In Greek, it means the way in which the Spirit specifically proceeds from the Father, whereas in Latin, it's a generic term for how any divine person who comes forth from another divine person would come forth. So to use it in the Greek sense would imply a rather weird heresy that nobody holds, which is that the Spirit proceeds from the Father through another divine person and then from the Son through another divine person. So because of this linguistic difference, the addition of the phrase filioque to the creed seemed absurd and heretical to the Byzantines, even though historically the doctrine which that represented was held on both sides of the Adriatic. Photius decided to exploit this confusion, a confusion which had been noted earlier during the Monothelite controversy by St. Maximus the Confessor, but he explained that it was merely linguistic, whereas this time Photius was deliberately exploiting the ambiguity in order to accuse the Pope of heresy for his own political reasons, and he began to teach and to present it as if it were the historic Byzantine doctrine that the Spirit proceeds from the Father alone rather than from the Father through the Son, and to stigmatize the use of the term filioque by Westerners as heretical. This would have devastating consequences in later church history. Initially, it led to Photius excommunicating the Pope and claiming to be independent of the See of Rome, but for internal, complicated political reasons, the Emperor Michael III was shortly after this deposed by the Emperor and murdered by the Emperor Basil I, and he, wanting validation for his rather irregular position, just as Photius had for his own, decided to restore relations with Rome and depose Photius in order to solve the question. This led to the summoning of the Fourth Council of Constantinople in the year 869 to 870, and at that council, the Photius was condemned, and attempts to depose the Pope in this irregular fashion were also condemned, and the doctrine that there was only one soul was solemnly defined, apparently because an earlier joke heresy invented by Photius for his own private amusement had been that there's more than one human soul, very obscure episode. Apparently he was trying to humiliate Ignatius by inventing a heresy that he thought Ignatius, who he held in intellectual contempt, would be unable to refute. So the council is quite significant. Unfortunately, later on, when Ignatius, who was restored to his see, died, Photius managed to persuade the new emperor that now it would be legitimate to make him finally legitimate Patriarch of Constantinople, and he then managed to manage a rival Fourth Council of Constantinople, which vindicated him and condemned the previous one. And Rome was unsure what to do about this. It accepted the reappointment of Photius in order to avoid trouble with Byzantium. But what to do about the second pseudo Fourth Council of Constantinople was rather unclear. The matter was never resolved because, due to the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the papacy had fallen completely into the hands of the local Roman aristocracy and entered into what is known as the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the papacy. So from the 880s onwards until around the year 1048, for much of that time, the papacy was in the hands of spectacularly unworthy individuals, often very young, in some cases teenagers, who were sometimes murdering their predecessors. Sometimes they would be the actual fathers of their successors. It's a particularly horrific period in the history of the papacy. In fact, at one point, one of the popes exhumed the corpse of his predecessor and placed it on trial because of a quarrel which he had with him. Of course, none of this impacts upon papal infallibility, which doesn't touch upon the morals of the popes, but certainly it is an extreme case of moral corruption in the papacy, the worst one probably in the whole of her history, rivaled only by the Renaissance papacy at the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century. One bright spot in this dark period in the West, during which the West was also subjected to renewed Muslim raids because of the breakdown of central authority, came in the defeat of the pagan Scandinavian attacks on Anglo-Saxon England, which nearly prevailed, but which were finally driven back by the great Anglo-Saxon king of Wessex, Alfred, who as a result became de facto the first king of England and founded the English kingdom and the English royal line. Also, Paris was subjected to Viking siege, and the Carolingian ruler Charles the Fat was unable to lift the siege, but a local aristocrat called Odo was, and his family would eventually become the Frankish royal dynasty, which reigned from the 10th century all the way down to the French Revolution and briefly thereafter. Also, the Slavs of Eastern Europe, particularly the region of the modern Czech Republic, Slovakia, parts of Ukraine and Hungary and Austria, were converted to Byzantine Christianity by the great brothers Cyril and Methodius, sent from Constantinople, but who maintained close and friendly relations with the popes and were honoured and protected by them, and who developed the Cyrillic alphabet in order to allow the written use of the Slavic languages and also the use of the vernacular in the Eastern liturgy, which was a new thing for a non-apostolic vernacular to be used and provided a precedent for that phenomenon in later church history.